So last week we heard about the people of Israel receiving manna in the wilderness. The people of Israel had just been delivered from slavery in Egypt. Moses led them out of Egypt. They escaped Pharaoh's army when God splits the Red Sea in two and lets them walk through on dry ground. They escaped thirst when God reveals this stick that when they throw it in bitter, nasty water, it suddenly becomes drinkable. And when they are desperately hungry in the middle of the desert, they escape that hunger when God gives them bread, manna, and quail to eat. Although the people grumble against Moses and his brother Aaron for bringing them out in the wilderness to die from hunger, God provides for them. God gives them what they grumble for. It's this gracious act. In today's lesson from Deuteronomy, we meet Moses and the people of Israel in a much different setting, many years after the manna episode. So it's been 40 years since the Red Sea and the bitter water and the manna and the quail in the wilderness. A lot has happened in those 40 years. Israel has received this thing called the law. So Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, receives the law from God. The law was meant to govern the relationship between the people of Israel and God. God makes a covenant. He makes this relationship with Israel to be their God and for them to be his people. And that law is the conditions of that covenant. So the law was the embodiment of what it meant to be in right relationship with God. And the foundation of that law is what we find in the Ten Commandments. So during Lent, we always recall this, we have this long list of the Ten Commandments that we know, hopefully by heart, when you're out of the confirmation process. There are all sorts of things about ethical stuff in that, and it's this basic understanding of what law is. But then there are all these other laws that Moses receives from God beyond these Ten Commandments. All sorts of laws about sacrifices, ritual purity, all that sort of stuff. But the basics of the law, the basics of what that covenant looks like between God and his people, the law that's actually written by the finger of God, that is the Ten Commandments. So the people of Israel, they receive the law. And you'd think that things would go really great for a group of people who have just been given divine law. Like they've been revealed, like they've received this wonderful revelation from God of what he desires out of his people, what the covenant's supposed to look like, all these sorts of things. You'd think that they would do great, but they don't. So instantly, after Moses receives the law, he walks down Mount Sinai, he's got the Ten Commandments in his hands, and what does he find when he gets to the base of the mountain? So he finds that the people have made a golden calf, this idol, out of the jewelry that they had taken from Egypt. So they take all this gold from Egypt, all this kind of plunder they bring with them, and they melt it down, and they make it into this golden idol, this golden calf. And they're worshiping it. It turns out that Moses had taken too long on top of the mountain. They thought that he was dead, and they decide, well, we're going to scrap whatever Moses had said. We're going to go back to what we were doing in Egypt, which is pagan worship. So they turn back to those trusted patterns of Egypt, and they embrace pagan worship that they see as something that works. Like that is what actually works in the world. And when Moses sees that scene, he famously smashes the tablets, and then he orders the golden calf to be burned down, mixed with water, and then he makes the people drink it. It's this wild episode. There's so many wild things that happen in the Exodus period. But it's an episode that becomes the basic template of what will happen as Israel makes their way through the wilderness into the promised land. God promises to be with his people. He covenants to be with his people. The people are in a good place. And then something happens that sets the people off, and they disobey, and then God disciplines his people. Now, the most famous episode of this cycle comes the first time that Israel attempts to enter the promised land. So it happens before the 40 years that we hear about in the wilderness. So Israel is on the doorstep of the promised land. They're on the doorstep of this land that God has promised to give them. And Moses sends out this reconnaissance mission into the promised land to kind of scope things out. He sends a reconnaissance mission of 12 spies. They're taken from the 12 tribes of Israel. And they go into Canaan, and they check out what things are like in there. So they go into the land, they see who's living there, they see what the land looks like, and they come back. Now, two of those guys, Caleb and Joshua, they see the land, they see who's living in it, and they trust that God will help them settle the land. But the other 10 guys who go in there, they're terrified. They're like, what is going on in this land? The warriors in Canaan, they're too big, the cities are too fortified, and Israel doesn't stand a chance. And the people listen to those 10 anxious guys. And they grumble against Moses and Aaron, and they decide that they're going to go back to Egypt. They're like, Moses, forget you, we're going back to Egypt. And they don't believe that God will be faithful, so they throw their hands up and give up. They give up on Moses, and they give up on God. And because of this, God disciplines them. God tells Moses that no one from that generation of spies will enter the promised land except for Caleb and Joshua. The people will wander in the wilderness for the length of a generation, 40 years. And after those 40 years, the people will again be given the opportunity to enter Canaan. Well, that brings us to today's passage from Deuteronomy. The 40 years have passed. The generation of spies have died out. Moses is super old. And the people of Israel are gathered on what's called the Plains of Moab, which is modern-day western Jordan. So it's right across the Jordan River from that land that we would call Canaan. And they're on this plateau that overlooks the land. And across the Jordan River is the city of Jericho. And if you went to Sunday school, you know what happens there. But for right now, the people of Israel, they stand at the doorway of the promised land. They stand at the doorway of everything that's been promised to them. All the hopes and dreams of the people of Israel lie just across the river. And as the people camp there on the plains of Moab, Moses takes the time to preach some sermons. Remember that this version of the people of Israel, this generation, they were young when the spies went into Canaan. They've lived most of their lives out there in the wilderness, just wandering around. So when Moses preaches, he is preparing this new generation of Israel to follow God in this new land. Moses himself will not actually be able to go into the land with them. While in the wilderness, there was this incident that happens at a place called Kadesh Meribah. And Moses disobeys a direct order from God, then takes credit for something that God was going to do. And because of that disobedience, Moses is not allowed to go into Canaan. He will die on Mount Nebo, overlooking the land of Canaan, but not actually getting to go over the Jordan River. So I want to pause there. Throughout the sermon so far, I brought up several occasions of God punishing people. There's the golden calf, there's the spies, and now there's Moses. And it can seem, when we read especially the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and really the entirety of the Old Testament, it can seem that God is rather harsh and exacting. And when people read these stories, they come to think that the God revealed in the Old Testament is in somehow different than the God who is revealed in the New Testament, in Jesus, in the person of Jesus. They say that the God of the Old Testament is angry and kind of vindictive and arbitrary in his punishment, and the God of the New Testament is loving and gracious. So this is a caricature of the Old and New Testaments, because there's plenty of love and grace in the Old Testament, and there's plenty of intensity and anger in the New Testament. But we are left with this question of why does God discipline his people and discipline them in the ways that he does in the Old Testament? So the answer to that question goes all the way back to the beginning of Israel's story, all the way back to Abraham, who is the father of the nation of Israel, all the way back to the core identity of the people of Israel. Who are the people of Israel called to be? This is the question that is asked all the way through the Old Testament. Who are these people called to be? Back in Genesis chapter 2, God makes a promise to Abraham. These are the first words that God says to Abraham first words that God says to this people who are going to be called Israel in the person of Abraham. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And here's the key part. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Abraham and his family are set apart. They're plucked out of all the people in the world to be a blessing to the world. And one of the ways that they will be a blessing is through being a holy nation. In Exodus 19, God says that Israel will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. They will embody the holiness of God as a people. When the world looks at the people of Israel, they will see a people defined by their relationship with a holy God, a God who is different than all the other gods that are around them in the ancient world. And that is a high calling. Israel is called to be this little platoon of holiness in a very broken world, a drop of holiness that will have a ripple effect throughout the world. And when Moses stands on the plains of Moab preaching his sermon, he calls the people back to that identity. Deuteronomy, the name of the book, literally means the second law. It's Moses rehashing the law from Mount Sinai for this new generation. He's bringing this new generation up to speed before they go into Canaan. And he also reminds them of the joys and struggles that happened in the wilderness. Moses says this in our reading. The whole commandment that I command you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. That's the promise. That is Israel's identity. That's who they are. They're called to be this people who follow the commands of God and are that holy people. So that's Israel's identity. And he continues. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what is in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So everything that happens in the wilderness, all of that crazy stuff that we read about in the books of Exodus and Numbers, all of that was meant to form the people of Israel. The discipline that happens is meant to form the people of Israel into this people who can go into the land and be the people that God desires them to be. It's meant to teach them. And the people of Israel are called to remember that, to remember both the promise of God's faithfulness, but also the testing that happened in the wilderness. They're not supposed to forget all the bad stuff that happened in the wilderness. They're supposed to remember that as a form of testing that taught them and helped them as they walked through the wilderness. Moses then says, and he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothing did not wear out on you, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. Know then in your heart, as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you. Discipline is meant to form Israel into the people that God desires them to be. God is faithful, and he wants Israel to be faithful to him, as a son is faithful to a loving parent. And I don't want you to miss what is said in that statement there. Know then in your heart, as a man disciplines his son, the Lord disciplines you. What God is saying there is, Israel, you are my children. There is a father-child relationship between God and his people. So the people of Israel are left with a question. Who will they be as they walk into the promised land of Canaan? Will they learn from the discipline and testing in the wilderness and follow God and embrace their identity as God's family and a holy nation? Or will they turn back to the paganism that surrounds them on all sides? The paganism of Egypt and of every nation that is around them. When we think about Israel at this period of time, they are just this little drop in the midst of a world that everybody has their own God. They are so strange in the ancient world. So will they live into their identity as the people of God, or will they do what everyone else is doing? As we read through the Old Testament, the people of Israel do live into their identity as the people of God at times. There are glimpses of faithfulness. We hear about these people who do these wonderful things and are faithful to God. But there are many occasions when they just go the way of the world around them. They worship the gods of the nations around them. They might try to worship the God of Israel alongside the gods of the nations that are around them, almost like doing this synchronistic type thing. So they worship the gods of the nations around them. They commit injustice, and they are not a holy nation. And they continue to experience this cycle of discipline and judgment and eventually exile from the promised land. They're sent into exile in Babylon. But we know that that is not the end of Israel's story. Because in the fullness of time, there is a man named Jesus who is born. And in Jesus, the God of Israel takes on flesh and becomes a Jewish man. And in each step of Jesus' life, he embodies what it is to be faithful Israel, to live into that identity of being the people of God and a holy nation. When we think about the relationship between the New Testament and the Old Testament, we have a tendency to think that somehow we have to find references. We read the New Testament and we try to figure out how the Old Testament fits in to the New Testament. When the New Testament writers are writing those documents, when they're talking about the Gospels, when Paul is writing those things, it is, where does Jesus find his place in the story of the Old Testament? How does the New Testament fit into the Old Testament? It's not the other way around. So, Jesus flows out of the Old Testament, and Jesus is everything of what Israel was supposed to be in the Old Testament. So Jesus lives into that identity perfectly. He keeps the law perfectly. He does justice. He is merciful. His holiness heals the brokenness of the world. And he is faithful to his Father. He is faithful to that child-father relationship, even to the point of death. And then he is vindicated and shown to be holy in the resurrection. And through it all, he is revealed to be faithful Israel. He is faithful Israel incarnate in one person there in front of the people of Israel. And through Jesus, new people are then invited into this family of God. And they are also called to faithfulness. In our lesson from Paul's letter to the Ephesians, the Apostle Paul tells the Ephesians that they were taught to put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. To follow Jesus, to be a part of the people of God, means to walk in the way of Jesus, who is that faithful Israelite. Now, we will not do that perfectly. We will mess up probably just as much as the people of Israel messed up. It is only Jesus who is that perfect Israel. And we are saved through our union with him and union with his work. But if we are in relationship with Jesus, if we are in relationship with the one who is that definition of what faithfulness is, our lives will look different. We will be changed. And that's what Paul is talking about in that reading from Ephesians. We read that long list of what seems like just kind of ethical rules. That is what it looks like to be faithful to Jesus, but also to the way of who God is. We have been given the Holy Spirit to transform us and to help us live as the faithful people of God, a faithful people who are defined by love and holiness. But it is ultimately up to us if we will live into that call as the faithful people of God. For the people of God, there is this constant call to faithfulness. Coming out of Egypt, there's a call. On Mount Sinai, there's a call. As they're standing there on the plains of Moab, there's a call. All throughout the Old Testament, there is this call to be faithful. And Jesus is faithful. So as we go out into the world, as we are our own little platoon of holiness going out into a world that is broken, who will we be? God has been faithful to us. He will always be faithful to us. Will we be faithful to him? Amen.